Chapter 22 is focusing on the ordeal of Reconstruction, 1865 to 1877. Reconstruction, this is the period of time immediately following the Civil War in which we figure out how the United States is going to be reconstructed or tied back together. So several questions to answer after that have to be answered after the war. First and foremost, how is the South going to be rebuilt, both physically and socially? Remember, the South is decimated from this war physically and also socially. Now that 4 million slaves have been freed via the 13th Amendment, how is that going to impact the South? What's going to become of these new freedmen? How are they going to be treated? What sort of rights are they going to have in the United States? How do we bring these southern states back to the Union? Is it going to be a very lenient plan in which they become a full-fledged member of the United States one more time, or is it going to be much more stringent or more difficult for them to come back to the Union? Who's actually in charge of Reconstruction? Is it the president? Is it Congress? Is it the military? Is it the South themselves that are focusing on how to rebuild? What's to become of Jefferson Davis and the other higher-up members of the Confederacy? So at the time of the end of the Civil War, Davis and some of the other higher-ups were put into jail until it was decided what would happen. Eventually they were pardoned, but their full rights were never fully restored. And what about this infrastructure in the South? The South was completely devastated in every single way. Cities were burned out, animals were dead, there was no way to start farming again. Immediately after the war, they lost $2 billion in wealth with the end of slavery, insane inflation, the infrastructure completely destroyed, meaning roads and bridges and railroads completely destroyed after the war. So how do we even begin to restore this? From an agricultural perspective, it wasn't until 1870, a full 5 years after the Civil War, that the South was able to produce a cotton crop at the same level as the 1860 level. And even from that perspective, it wasn't in their original fields. It was in new fields, mainly in the Southwest. And really, to many Southerners, even into today, the Civil War is considered the lost cause. You know, that Southerners didn't willingly come back to the Union. Many of them remained defiant against the Union. They were unwilling to reconcile. So this is going to be another issue that has to be determined during this period of time of Reconstruction. So first up with the Freedmen. In March of 1865, the war's not even yet quite over yet, but obviously the writing is on the wall. Congress created the Freedmen's Bureau to help assist these newly freed blacks to achieve education and other skills that might be necessary for independence. So these are educational skills, job skills, etc., whatever they would need for freedom. Oliver Howard, the Union general, served as the head of it. He later founded Howard University in Washington, D.C., which is a historically black college. And through the Freedmen's Bureau, 200,000 former slaves were taught to read. Because remember, under slavery, it was illegal to teach a slave how to read or write. And the hope with this was to help to start closing that gap between whites and blacks. And for many of the slaves, this was an intergenerational thing. You know, grandparents sitting alongside their grandchildren learning how to read and other skills. But for many of them, their major goal was to learn to read the Bible, obviously, because that was something that had been denied them so long. Now, like any other large bureaucracy or like any other large organization, they didn't always act properly. Obviously, there was going to be some corruption going on. In many cases, there are historical accounts of white people in the Freedmen's Bureau, both Union and Southerners, collaborating together to keep power away from the newly freed African Americans. Many of them were denied that 40 acres and a mule that had been promised to them after the war, and even coerced into signing labor agreements with their old masters. But for the most part, the Freedmen's Bureau was focusing on helping to reform this part of society. From a Southern perspective, the Freedmen's Bureau was just the government meddling in their business once again, and it really angered them after the Civil War. Here you see a Democratic view of the Freedmen's Bureau. Now, keep in mind that for a really long time after the Civil War, the South was not going to vote for the Republican Party because the Republican Party was the party of Lincoln. The South is going to be solidly Democrat. You hear the term solid South because no matter who it is, what the issues are over, whatever, the South voted Democrat for a very, very long time. And so from this Democratic view of the Freedmen's Bureau, it was just the government giving the newly freed slaves a chance to lay about while the honest white man over here in the corner is doing all of the work. So it's obviously a very negative view of the Freedmen's Bureau. Here you see the Republican view that they're the ones standing in between, helping to bring about the needed reform for society from a Republican viewpoint. Now, to start with, nobody really knew what Reconstruction was going to look like. There wasn't one plan put in place that everyone got behind immediately. It was kind of this hodgepodge working together and arguing and fighting. And so at least in the beginning, the president decided to start planning for Reconstruction. And in fact, Lincoln, obviously before he was assassinated, had started planning for Reconstruction way back in 1863. From his perspective, since secession was not legal, the South had never officially left the Union. So according to Lincoln, restoring them back to the Union should be very quick, very painless. So Lincoln proposed this 10% plan. This was his goal for Reconstruction. Obviously, it never went through because he was assassinated, but he had wanted this 10% plan. So that when 10% of the state's voters in the presidential election, obviously these are Southern voters, took a loyalty oath and pledged to uphold emancipation, then they would be restored and could start to establish a new state government. So if 10% of the state's voters from the last presidential election took a loyalty oath to the U.S. Constitution and pledged to uphold emancipation, they could start to rebuild and create a new state government. Congress at the time worried that this was way too mild. This was not strong enough. And so Congress had countered Lincoln's 10% plan with the Wade-Davis bill in 1864. They wanted 50% of the voters to take a loyalty oath. And they wanted some stronger safeguards for emancipation. Lincoln basically said no to this by pocket vetoing this, meaning he refused to sign it. He stuck it in his pocket. So at the time, and this becomes more and more apparent as Reconstruction goes on, there are two major factions within Congress, within the Republican Party. Radical Republicans, very, very radical Republicans, and moderate Republicans at this time. The radicals obviously want the South to be punished. They want that Southern aristocracy to come back on their knees, so to speak, begging. The moderates, on the other hand, agreed more with Lincoln, but somewhat more on Congress's terms. So even within the Republican Party, there is a division about what Reconstruction should look like. Well, the problem is Lincoln was assassinated, obviously, in 1865, and in comes Andrew Johnson. Now, Andrew Johnson, remember, was a Democrat and had only been put on the ballot in 1864 to lure in those war Democrats. And so Johnson was really going to clash with Congress over this issue, and we'll see that in the coming part of this chapter. But in May of 1865, he issued his own Reconstruction plan, in which he took away all the rights of the leading Confederates. Now, part of Johnson's Reconstruction proclamation was each of these leading Confederates could ask for a personal pardon from Johnson. So basically, they have to come to Johnson on a personal level and ask for a pardon. This is giving Johnson a whole lot of power, and trust me, Congress was not happy about this idea. Also part of Johnson's Reconstruction plan was he wanted each of the southern states to hold a state convention in which they had to do several things. First, they had to repeal their secession order, saying, just kidding, we didn't actually secede. Second, they had to ratify that 13th Amendment, emancipation of all slaves. And three, they had to repudiate or basically slough off their Confederate debts, meaning anyone that had loaned money to the Confederacy, sorry, you're not getting your money back. Once they did those things, according to Johnson, they could be readmitted to the Union as a full-fledged member. Now, Johnson was giving out lots of pardons left and right, and that old aristocracy, that planter class, very quickly based on that, started rising up again and rebuilding their state governments very, very quickly. And so, as the Southern aristocracy started to rebuild after the war, because they were following Johnson's Reconstruction plan, they started trying to create a state government that looked very, very, very similar to the old government that they had had, establishing what were known as black codes in November of 1865. This started in Mississippi and then obviously very quickly spread to the rest of the South. Now, these were very scarily similar to the slave codes that we've seen in the past, and the purpose of them was to control the black population, to make the black population subservient to the white people. So sure, we have emancipated our slaves. Sure, we have ratified the 13th Amendment. But that doesn't mean they are not going to have a similar status under the new government. Also, it forced African Americans to sign labor contracts that committed them to an employer for a minimum of 1 year. Their goal was to bring back that cotton kingdom very, very quickly and get these black people back in the fields growing the cotton. The problem, though, with this, they were paid very, very meager wages, and if they left for whatever reason, they forfeited all of their pay or could even be dragged back by these people called Negro catchers, very reminiscent once again of the slave catchers. So essentially, what are they creating here? They're creating slavery in everything but name here. And so this new system that is created with white power in the South is creating generations of sharecroppers, both for African Americans and for poor whites too. These are people who can't afford to own their own land. And so they basically rent a small plot of land from the owner of the large fields. You can never get out of debt because you owe that owner or the plantation owner more money than you can ever pay off. It is constant debt. It's similar to the old feudal system. It's also known as tenant farming because you don't actually own any of the land. So from a northern perspective, seeing what the South is trying to create here, the North is angry about this. What did we fight for? What did 600,000 men die for in the Civil War if we're just creating a system extremely similar to the one that we've already had? So in steps Congress. Congress says, no way, this isn't going to happen, especially when in December of 1865, many of these southern states who, according to Johnson, were newly reconstructed, started sending members back to Congress, many of whom were ex-Confederates. The vice president of the Confederacy knocking on Congress's door to be admitted. Congress freaked out. Number one, they said it's way too fast and this was way too lenient of a reconstruction. Also, they feared that there would be a Democratic takeover. Remember, all of these Southerners coming back in were Democrats. They weren't voting Republican for, at least another 100 years. And they feared, the Republicans, and very rightly so, that the Southern Democrats would link up with the Northern Democrats and take over complete control of Congress. Now remember, the Republicans had had control of Congress all during the war. They were fearful about giving up that power. Also add to that, now that the 13th Amendment has been ratified and slavery is now abolished, that 3/5 compromise is now gone. And so the black population, even though they can't vote, and even though they are in a subservient status down south, are now counted as a whole person. This is granting 12 more electoral votes to Congress, 12 more congressmen based on this increase in their population. And so the final straw came when in February of 1866, Johnson vetoed a bill that would have extended the Freedmen's Bureau. Eventually this did get passed over Johnson's veto, but Congress has had enough. The Republicans in Congress are not going to let the president hijack Reconstruction. They are not satisfied with presidential Reconstruction. And so this clash with Congress and Johnson begins. The Republicans in Congress in March of 1866 tried to pass a civil rights bill to grant some citizenship rights for African Americans. Once again, Johnson vetoed this, and it was eventually passed over his veto. Enough is enough. So the Civil Rights Act, or the Civil Rights Act that Congress tried to pass in 1866, it would have granted some citizenship rights to newly freed African Americans. But Congress began to realize that this is just a piece of legislation. Who's to say that one day this isn't going to be overturned by a future Congress, like we saw happen time and time again? They needed something stronger. They needed something more to protect African Americans in the South. And so Congress began proposing the 14th Amendment to grant citizenship rights to African Americans. This does not include voting rights. Make sure you understand that. And this was presented to the South. Now, they wanted the southern states to allow black voting in their state constitution. So kind of a middle ground was that if you don't allow black voting, then you will have a reduced representation in Congress. They were trying to lure them into allowing it on a state basis, but not on a federal basis. The 14th Amendment also denied any office to a former Confederate who had once sworn to uphold the U.S. Constitution and then seceded. So people like Jefferson Davis, who had served as Secretary of the War, had obviously sworn to uphold the U.S. Constitution and then had seceded from the U.S. to join the Confederacy. The 14th Amendment also required the Southern states to repudiate or ignore their Confederates' debts. All of this was part of the 14th Amendment, but the most major part of it was citizenship rights for African Americans. Many Democrats didn't want this, but by 1866, the midterm elections, the Republicans were now veto-proof, and they could pass any piece of legislation over Johnson's veto, no matter what. So within Congress, we see two groups within the Republican Party. The Radicals, led by Charles Sumner in the Senate, yes, that same guy that got beat before the war, and Thaddeus Stevens in the House. These are very radical Republicans. Both of them are advocating for racial equality. Thaddeus Stevens, in addition, wanted the South to pay for their crimes. They saw, from a radical perspective, the South as a conquered territory. That yes, in fact, they had seceded from the Union, and so they had been brought to their knees and were going to be treated as such. The Radicals wanted to use the federal power to revolutionize every part of the South, their institutions, their habits, their manners, to completely change everything about Southern society. Now, within the Republican Party, there were also moderates. These were much more, they were kind of leery of how extreme Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner and the likes of them were. These were people who were Republicans, but they still wanted some states' rights to be focused on. They wanted to ensure citizenship rights, but with as little government involvement as was possible. But what both groups did agree on was on voting rights for African Americans. This would eventually become a goal. And here you see Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens. And in part 2, we will talk about the next stage of Reconstruction.